right. Well, good morning. We cover little topics each month. We try to, and this month, an idea came up about infill construction, and it's something that we hope for in most of our Main Street districts, where we have missing buildings, or where we have areas that are just underutilized. Different areas that you think you could expand your district, and ideally have more sales tax revenue and beautify the area. And we've lost buildings through the years from fires and other things like that. Some of them are in poor physical condition and may need major remediation, and so that sort of counts as infill. And then I'll talk about some temporary uses too for buildings that aren't full. So on the first slide here, we're going to talk more about it a little bit. This top left is actually in Louisville in a back alley. I just thought it was a wonderful concept that they expanded out the back, but they made it almost like a primary facade. It's really attractive. It's down an alley. There's public art in the alley. Very nice. And then on the right is actually in Louisville too, and it is a development of something adjacent to Main Street, like kind of off one of the side street areas. They don't really have a Main Street. They have a little district. This is just off the edge of that, and it really is the edge of the district. And it's primarily housing. I don't actually think there may be a little business or two in there, but they're mostly little townhomes, and very cool. They essentially took the aesthetic of Main Street and the way the buildings were developed with second floor vertical oriented windows and storefront type entrances on some of the bottom levels, and they scaled it down a little bit, which I think is okay for this, because you don't need grand scale like you do for commercial for a house, right? So, and it also has some differentiation from historic in that there's some relief to the front of the facades that kind of step in and out from the sidewalk. And it lets you know right off that it's not historic. And that's very important when we do infill development, is that we make sure that we're not trying to mimic the past. We don't want people to be confused about whether a building actually is historic or not. So we need to make sure we work well with what's in the surrounding district, but at the same time, design something that's compatible. And I think that's a good example of that. And that's sort of what we're talking about here. When you put a new building in, or even redevelop an existing building, or expand the use to a second floor, you want to think about what the needs are for the community. Of course, you want to think about the architecture so that it fits well into the district, particularly in a mid-block building like this, or anything where there's historic buildings adjacent to the new building. You would want to make sure that you studied that in some stylistic and carried over some stylistic details. Whether or not that's how the second floor aligns across buildings. It's the slope of the roof. You wouldn't see a steep sloped roof on most of our commercial districts. Lake City kind of comes to mind as one that they have a lot of snow, and so those are steeply pitched. Silverton has some snow issues on some of their flat roofs, but there's a lot of those steeply pitched. So thinking about what you have and doing an inventory, and really just kind of thinking through it, and that's what I'm here for too. But meeting with the person that's going to redevelop or construct new, and thinking, well, what can we do to improve the character, but still not necessarily make it, the improvements make look like they're old. And I want to talk a little bit through this about, new buildings, underutilized spaces in buildings, temporary structures, and pop-up shops as some options for this. So what's a barrier to infill development? There are more than what I'm listing here. Generally, you have folks that are, a little bit apathetic to the cause of putting a commercial business back in a building. They own it. They may have inherited the space. They pay taxes on it. But they may not even have the water turned on a lot of times, right? And there are various ways to approach that. Tracy actually worked with a university student last year to finish up a vacant building resource toolkit. And so that's a valuable resource. I believe it's online. Really to work through the process of working with these types of owners. It can be a challenge. And one of the funny things to get kind of guilt some property owners into doing something is, I've heard in some communities they might have a little board in the barber shop or a place that people frequent, and they could show the picture of the property and just say, this needs to be redeveloped, or kind of a wall of shame sort of thing. and then connections might start to happen where, there gets to be some inertia and some excitement built in the community, and then that can get passed on to those property owners who maybe want to have a vested stake in the downtown, but they might not know what to do. And I think that's a big one too. Sometimes the buildings are in a state of repair where they're not really occupiable. They're not necessarily, up to code. And so when they've had the water turned off for a certain amount of time, usually about 2 years, then it does trigger some code requirements where you do need to go in and you need to make like electric up to code and things like that. It's almost like the building is like a new use, because it was vacant as a use for a while. Now it's going to have a business in it, so they actually have to adhere to some regulations, and local and state regulations are going to vary. I mean, locally, like what's acceptable or what's required in one community might not be acceptable in other communities, or they may have other requirements that are beyond necessarily code. It just really depends on planning in your community. And but you want good quality stuff getting put back in, right? You don't want things that could potentially have a fire hazard or don't have the right kind of egress, when you could make those changes beforehand and make the business even that much better. And then funding is really kind of the crux of it all. Now, on our website, there is a fact sheet or a web page under design where I think it says something like design improvements and green energy improvements or something like that. You can find that, and if you scroll to the bottom, I think it's one of the first links in design under resources. You go to the bottom and it has a commercial redevelopment strategy for a property owner. And it really just talks through the process that we've developed kind of as this heritage energy approach that we are trying to solidify here in the state. And it talks through, here's how you start. Here's how you leverage financing. Here's how you pay it back using tax credits and so on. So where our strategies here, it might seem a little bit complex or convoluted to a property owner, or even, you guys potentially. But that's, again, why we're here, that we can actually work with a property owner to, get a project designated locally, state, or federal, so that it could qualify for some of the state incentives. And generally, though, not all the state incentives will qualify for private property. If it's just a commercial business and it doesn't have a great deal of historic significance, a good example, in Brush, Irene, the Sands Theater would probably qualify, for facade improvements through the State Historical Fund. Now, they would have to be done in alignment with the Secretary of the Interior standards, so the digital board might not work, but it might. And that's the thing that, working through that process, they would help you, like say, we can't fund that. That's not, and actually it's going to disqualify the whole project, stuff like that. So, but if it has a high public use or high public benefit, then State Historical Fund will generally look at funding those, and then you can go in for competitive grant. There are non-competitive grants, like I was talking with Darcy before the meeting, for writing like a nomination for historic status through like the state or national register. And there are, and what you can get is it's a planning grant, and you can use that to hire a consultant that is actually an expert in writing these nominations. And you'll learn a lot about the history of the building. And also, that's your best chance to get a building designated, unless you've written several of these. And that's not something we have a lot of time to do. They're very intensive and just good quality products that you end up in the end with that will help you be nominated. So, my mantra is to always look back at the past before moving ahead. And this is my hometown in Oklahoma, a town called Poteau. And this is actually a view looking right up Dewey Avenue, which is the area in the center with all the brick buildings. And I know they're brick because they're red. And the buildings that are blue are stone. And buildings that are yellow are wood structures. And then I can compare this photo to the right that was taken, I want to say, in the early 40s, looking up Dewey Avenue from approximately this intersection here. And I can see what the original facades look like. So these Sanborn fire insurance maps are incredibly useful, and they have a little key up here on the top right that explains, what the different colors and what the little notations mean. because you can learn a lot. You can learn if it's one or two stories. Where is the primary entrance way? What is actually in there at the time of the map's creation, which varies over time. Things change. Where it maybe used to be a place for somebody to make hats, it might have turned into a barber shop in the 40s. And the thing to note though here is these don't go much beyond the mid 40s, but they do tell you the early history of your community, which is just fantastic. And then pairing that with photographs, it tells you a lot about what was the building that's missing. You can learn more about it, and then you can see how big it was, and then that gives you some precedent for moving forward with, say, a new construction. And you wouldn't, again, mimic the look of the past building, but potentially the way the windows were laid out. That might make a lot of sense because it would be compatible, and we know originally it was built that way. And so you take hints from the past and then move forward with those. This is a great resource, and I want to make you all aware of this. I'm a member of the Association for Preservation Technology, and on the top right, there's something called the Building Technology Heritage Library, and it is extremely rich in old historic, like home plans, commercial building plans, like you're seeing right here, with an upstairs residence on the one to the right, and it tells you like, here's the dining room, living room, that's a bedroom, and so, and that was just a model that was built. These are cool to look at, and there's not too many of these. This is Radford stores and flat buildings. You used to could get a plan for $1. Isn't that cool? And it'll show you just typically how these were done and what the storefronts looked like in that era. There are many resources on this, and you can use filters to get down to things you're interested in, like the old storefront framing, for example, that's made out of copper, and we have it in a lot of our communities up until the mid-century. You could learn more about that product, even though it's not made anymore. You could learn, what did the replacement part look like? So maybe somebody could fashion a corner piece or just different elements. And so, definitely worth poking around here. It's a fun resource. Okay, so questions to ask. What was appropriate in the past? What kinds of uses were there? It might not be light industrial right on the commercial sidewalk, and it might not be first floor residential. It could have been. So we need to understand those things and do the research. And then what kind of infill today would work well? This is a cool resource from the National Trust Main Street Center in 1995. Main Street was fairly new still, and it's actually a 2-page document. And I'm going to walk you through it pretty quick. I have this document, a high quality scan of it, and I'm glad to share it with you guys. And if you want it, just let me know. It's no longer published. This was something that was done by an architect friend of mine. He's retired now, and it talks about how to make buildings work. Like, how do you fill a hole where there's something missing downtown? Well, so I'm gonna zoom in. Oh, it won't let me do that. I apologize. In any case, it starts talking about buildings with traditional commercial districts share a similar height. So something that's much taller than the original buildings, like in, say, in Brush and most of Haxton and Wellington, actually too, there's not a lot of 2-story buildings. So you have to be very careful about how you do that. I'll show you an example of one later that was successful. But generally, you want to stay within the same general height. Again, you want the floor-to-floor heights to match, so that if you do have a second floor, the windows on the second floor look correct next to others. The width, these buildings were typically built on 25-foot platted lots. Now, sometimes the buildings are 50 feet wide. And there can be other oddball numbers for widths. You can have a 12.5-foot wide building. I've seen it. There's a little shoe shop in Steamboat that's just really great. I've actually gone in and bought a pair of shoes there. Then there are some buildings that are 20 feet. There are other so it really varies. And so the ones that were 50 feet were typically 2 original plat lots. So we kind of have to stick with that on Main Street. There's not a lot of extra room to build out. But as we expand the district, it's something to also consider, like doing townhome residential adjacent to the district or 1 block away. let's respect some of the form of Main Street. It's not that you couldn't do two stories in any of your communities, but we just need to be thoughtful about it. And then it talks about proportion, the relationship to the street. For example, you don't want a building that's set back from the front of the sidewalk when everything else is on the sidewalk. It just creates kind of that missing tooth feel, and it doesn't really work aesthetically and really in function either. Roof and cornice, we want those things to have similar level of detail, like in our Victorian communities like Silverton, Leadville. There's very ornate cornices made out of pressed metal, and those aren't as appropriate in communities that developed more later on. The Victorian period was early. It was like 1880s, and it ended right around the turn of the century. So it wasn't a real long period, but we see those in certain places. And then composition, the composition of the infill facade should be similar to that of surrounding facades. And you can actually see on number 6 here in the middle how they've sort of worked in all the windows aligned across there on the second floors. That's to me very important. Rhythm, rhythms carry through the block, such as window spacing. They should be incorporated into a new facade. If you built one of these buildings as a new building and you put 2 windows in the middle of it instead of 3, like everything else, it might be a little funky unless you really play with proportions and make it work, or give it a different style, which we'll talk about that later, so that it's not looking historic. But still, we respect these elements. Proportions of openings, this is a little bit more about that. They should be similar. The doors, the storefronts, and the percentage essentially of the brick area, if they're brick, or solid wall area, to the areas that are see-through. Materials, thinking about materials, keeping things similar. You don't go downtown and and this applies to existing buildings too with materials, and it's something everyone should hear, especially some property owners that aren't sure what to do. Like, we don't put corrugated rusty metal on under our storefronts. It's not appropriate to the era of almost any building that's not already, that's been built, unless was built in, the 90s or the 90s or so on. And then color is important. Color of brick is important. You can stand out in a bad way if you use like a gray brick in a town that has all clay, native, harvested, orange or red brick or yellow brick sometimes. So just watching that. Let's jump into what underutilized space can look like. This is a community, actually, happened before my time, but is the best example of slip cover removals, which is the metal that covers the upper floors and sometimes just the upper part of a one-story building's facade. And it blocks things like these wonderful transom windows that you see, those windows above the door and below the second floor windows. This is in Okmulgee, Oklahoma. This is where I believe the Creek Native Americans capital. It sits in the corner, in the center of the square. It's a very cool town. This was the picture on the left, occurred probably in the mid to late 90s. And then it shows you something like fast forward a decade, and you can see what things look like today. And it's just tremendous. And there was reasoning for this. The reasoning included, number one, this town was known for the era that's represented in the restored version. The mid-century era, when culture became more based on the automobile and strip malls outside of town, folks wanted it to look like that. And they didn't use their second floors as much because people were occupying offices and other places to live in the suburbs or in the outside part of your town. So they basically started using the upper floors for vacant use, nothing, and maybe for storage. And then they put these cheap metal covers that are corrugated typically, or something called a standing seam maybe, and then these cheap awnings out. Now, some districts, this is appropriate, and it occurred as part of the natural rhythm of development for the district. And so in those examples, we have a challenge in removing those slip covers. There's an example of that I'm working on right now in Lamar, and a historic bank building. And half of the facade is covered with metal, half of it isn't. Folks at History of Colorado think the metal may be significant. you can't reopen the second floor because you covers the windows. You can't have residences up there. So it's really kind of a cruxy situation sometimes. Upper floor redevelopment's big. Using the rear of the building. We don't need these really super deep, long buildings. The lots are platted that way. Sometimes they're built very deep. We can often do rear of building businesses as long as there's a common corridor that can connect the front to the back for emergency egress. And that's actually been done really well in Windsor. I was looking at a building a couple of weeks ago, and there's one where they put smaller offices in the back, like 5 offices, and in the front it's a boutique. And there is a corridor that connects the two from the front to the back. So the offices are off to the sides and the corridors in the middle. Works beautifully. There's parking back there, everything. So be on the lookout for those kinds of situations. And here's a little bit about that. So outdoor spaces, we have plenty of these that are underutilized. I could have put 5 slides together with this many photos on each, showing you that if you have lots that are corner lot, a lot of times where there maybe was a gas station, it's just abandoned, or, maybe there is just a green space that maybe you could create a nice park space. We know about that, but how could you make it capture some revenue and be a place that is more vital? So really pocket parks are kind of they're an opportunity when you have the space and you could use some green space. You have plenty going on, but if you don't, then think about what you could put a snow cone stand in there. Hardly anybody in Colorado has snow cones, it seems like, or at least around the metro. And I don't know why. But that could be a big deal for the summertime. Again, this is this building in Louisville with this wonderful backdoor entry that looks like a primary facade. Even just putting up lights above an alley can help activate that space and create a linkage from one block to the other. That feels a little safer and it's visually appealing. This is a corner lot in the middle here of a Chevy dealership, an old historic Chevy dealership, where the corner lot, I believe, was a gas station, and it's abandoned, and they didn't reconstruct it. It didn't even fill the lot, right? It was smaller. It had an area for a drive-through. I've seen those repurposed and very successfully sometimes, like in Trinidad. There's one right downtown, right in the middle of everything, that's still utilized for commercial reasons. But this one, they actually created a beer garden, and it's lovely. It's a place you could see people. It's funny, there's no folks in the photo, but down below it there is. This is in Arvada, and it's just showing how they built out most of the sidewalk, which I'm not sure how that all works with their code and egress, and accessibility, but that's what we have. It's always busy. So just be looking out for opportunities there, and we're glad to help with that too. And then I just wanted to show some examples of how we can use like temporary structures, like these shipping containers. I am not a fan of shipping containers. They can work in a historic district and they could be kind of a cool element. They're just not easy to outfit for a new use. They're not made to do that. They're hard to insulate correctly because you end up with condensation when you fire out the walls on the inside with insulation. It's hard to make it look like this from the outside and insulate it correctly. That's what we're getting. But they can be very appealing, and they often do cost quite a bit per square foot to develop. So you have to have a real high intensity use that has a lot of turnover to make it viable, a lot of money turning over in the cash register. And on the left, I found this photo this morning. I think it's wonderful. And Denver has a similar initiative for pop-up shops. And this one, this is occupying a vacant building storefront. They might go in there 15 feet, 20 feet deep. Think of a use they could do this for. You talk with the building owner. You say, hey, we pay you a little bit here and pay for electric or whatever. We're just going to have this event, or we're going to have this open for the summer. And we're going to occupy the front of the building. You could actually have a sign that talked about the building and just call it, whatever the name of the business is up here instead of saying retail incubator. But that's cool too. Maybe if you at your town or somebody or not-for-profit or something doesn't need the front and they use the back, maybe they could do something like this to help generate revenue for their organization. And so for new buildings, another way to think about those really cool little drawings that I was talking to you in the beginning about, that were like little diagrams about build this size, think about proportion. A real quick way to think about this was developed by Georgia Main Street. This is another document on the right that is good to check out, but the FRESH acronym means footprint and foundation. roof shape, building envelope, like the size of it, the overall in what area is enveloped, the skin or the cladding, like is it brick, is it siding, things like that, and then the holes, the window and door rhythm. So if those elements are met, it's pretty good. But then those other ones ought to be studied too. On the picture in left, this is a building in the middle. You can probably tell which one is not historic, is in Telluride. So they've gone with this very schwanky, which honestly, there's too much glass area on that first floor. But I wanted to show you, and actually the cornice up at the top is very cool. It's like welded plate steel. And I think it's a really good modern interpretation, borrowing some ideas on form and alignment with the adjacent businesses or buildings that looks great. I just think they could have enclosed a little bit more of that lower facade. It just has a black storefront with black glass, or glass looks dark during the daytime almost always. But to me, it doesn't read well, and it doesn't look like it's cohesive with the rest of the district. But I love the idea of it. Again, here on the top right, this is that development for residential on the outskirts of Louisville's downtown. And on the bottom right, this 3-story brick building is in Ridgeway, and it sits sort of across the highway from the Main Street district. It's next to this really cool restaurant called NAR, and I believe it has ground floor commercial, and then it has upper floor residential. And it's a great looking building, real clean cut. It's 3 stories, which to my I don't think there are any other 3-story commercial buildings in Ridgeway. So, but it works because it's not adjacent to any of the historic buildings that are across the highway. Stylistically, it fits well. These arches might not have been incorporated. Load-bearing masonry, of course, was. Now, this is probably has steel frame inside, but the arches are cool, and they sort of evoke a higher level of quality. The window rhythm is just like you would see in a commercial building in the district. So it's a very good example of good infill. And then the last thing I just want to mention is that it is important to have some guidelines to protect these things. I've actually seen communities adopt those one shooters at the beginning portion and things like that, if they don't have exact design guidelines, because it gives you something to stand on when you're talking about development in the district. And that would be adopted by the community. It could be redone. I could provide more insight on that. But essentially, you want to use, if you use illustrations, which are very important, you use illustrations for key design features. You use district-specific photographic examples from both the past and present of good design. If you start putting negative examples of buildings in your community, it's not going to work out well for you. People aren't going to appreciate that. And also, let's don't really even visualize the things that don't look great. I think we know it doesn't look well, right? And that's just my 2 cents on that. Some people like to have the do nots and do this and don't do this. It sort of draws out it makes something a lot harder to understand, in my opinion. Let's just talk about the principles. We can compare a building to that. We know what to change. And then, just like with the presentation today, I want you guys to be, semi-experts on this. I want now that we've talked a little bit about it, I think you might have a good opportunity. If today you talk with somebody about a vacant lot or something, you could talk intelligently about it. And this is a resource. We're going to have this presentation up online. How does it work though? Like funding, again, the crux element of things. I know Brush has a wonderful CARES program that offers business incentives. I don't know if it covers new development. Sometimes the city might not charge certain fees, tap fees and so on, or even do a sales tax rebate for the first year or 2. I mean, there's different ways the town can help. But if someone gets an incentive, and this is not done sometimes, and it's very important, if they take an incentive from the town or from your organization, they need to do things right. They can't just throw a sign up that's obtuse or just gaudy or things that doesn't work with the district. So the design guidelines are important here to define that in language that's adopted by the town and overseen by a preservation commission or board if you have it. Otherwise, the planning office has to take care of that. It's often not set up. Often there's not a historic district designated. And so there's no differentiation between outline development down the highway a bit, or, in another area of town that's newer from what's older. And so that's an important reason to set up a historic district. And that kind of starts the process of that differentiation. And really, if they take the money, they should follow the guidelines. And you can even set that up as part of a grant program. I'm not saying the town has to have formally adopted this and have a preservation commission. You can just say, as part of the contract, we will provide this much of a facade grant match or this type of an improvement, and you have to follow our standards. Boom. If it's infill development, share those 2 sheets with them and say, before you even start design, I want you to look at this because this is what we're looking for. And then that's sort of the big takeaway there. This is somebody saying goodbye from Trinidad. Actually, it's a mannequin hand, which kind of freaked me out. But anybody have any questions about infill? I can take those now. And if not, just thanks for listening, and appreciate it. And we'll have another one next month similar to this. And this will be posted up online in the near future. And then we'll provide that link out to the entire managers listserv so you guys